In this series, we're going over all the cards on the ban list, why they're there, if they could come off, and how they could possibly be fixed to come off the ban list if they're still too strong. Today, we're going to go over a bunch of lands and cards that synergize with land cards. First off, we have Eye of Ugin. This is a legendary land with the abilities where all of your Eldrazi creatures cost 2 less to cast. It also has the ability where you can pay 7 mana and tap it to search your library for a colorless creature card and put it into your hand, and then you have to shuffle. This card was banned back in April of 2016. So why was Eye of Ugin banned? I actually saw a ton of play in Tron decks in Modern for years, but this has almost nothing to do with the card being banned. Tron decks try to use the Tron lands to cast giant creatures, such as the Eldrazi, extremely early, and Eye of Ugin pulled double duty by making your big, scary Eldrazi's cheaper to cast and letting you constantly tutor up huge threats to keep casting. While this was really good, it was actually Eldrazi aggro decks that broke Eye of Ugin. You see, when the Eldrazi were first released in Rise of Eldrazi, the cheapest Eldrazi card still cost 7 mana, which was more than the most expensive cards in most decks. So while I did help cast them, it wasn't letting you power them out on turn 1 or 2. This all changed with the release of Oath of the Gatewatch. In this set, Wizards released a ton of cheap Eldrazi, like Eldrazi Mimic and Thought-Knot Seer. With these cards and Eldrazi Temple, a land that tapped for 2 mana to cast an Eldrazi, you could flood the board with Eldrazi creatures extremely early, leading to tons of turn 3 kills. Even worse, a ton of these Eldrazi had really strong effects, such as Thought-Knot Seer, which ripped a card right out of their hand when it entered the battlefield, or Reality Smasher, which required your opponent to 2-for-1 themselves to remove it. So not only was this deck extremely explosive, it also took a ton of resources away from you and took a ton of resources to try and remove their threats. This was so much better than all the other decks in the format, it was easily the best deck. Eldrazi aggro decks were taking 4 out of 8 top spots in a ton of top tournaments, and showing no signs of slowing down. To stop these decks from being the best deck in the format, Wizards banned Eye of Ugin, as it was previously obviously the most problematic card in the deck due to being able to basically give you 4 or even 6 mana on turn by reducing the cost of multiple spells. Could Eye of Ugin be unbanned? No. Modern has gotten a lot faster and stronger, but Eldrazi decks have still stuck around, even though they're much worse than they used to be. Having 8 copies of lands that essentially make 2 mana is incredibly strong, and having Eye back would make the explosive plays that Eldrazi aggro decks used to be known for come right back. Modern would be able to adjust to it better than they used to, with cards like Fury being able to remove multiple 1 toughness creatures on turn 1, but Thought-Knot being able to rip important cards out of your opponent's hand while also applying tons of pressure is uniquely strong. Other decks can put out similar damage with good draws, but they can't interact with their opponent at the same time. Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple just weren't designed to work with cheaper creatures, and having any cheap Eldrazi that are better than vanilla beaters makes the cards inherently problematic. How could Eye of Ugin be fixed to be unbanned? If the effect was changed to making Eldrazi spells cost 1 less to cast instead of 2, it would probably be enough to let the card be unbanned. This would still make it very strong, but it wouldn't let you play a bunch of Mimics on turn 1 or Thought-Knot on turn 2. This makes the deck more explosive without being super explosive, and means they still have to draw 2 temples to rip a card from your opponent's hand on turn 2. This stops the deck from being the explosive, hard to interact with menace, while leaving most of the effective Eye of Ugin intact. Next, we have Summer Bloom. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green with the effect where you can play 3 additional lands this turn, which means with your normal land drop, you can play a total of 4 lands on that turn, which does stack with other copies of itself or other similar cards, like Azusa Lost But Seeking. This card was banned in January of 2016. Why was Summer Bloom banned? Summer Bloom is really strong with some other land-based ramp spells, in particular Amulet of Vigor and Bounce lands. Amulet is an artifact with a cost of 1 and the ability where, whenever a permanent enters the battlefield under your control tapped, you untap that permanent. Bounce lands are lands that enter the battlefield tapped and return a land from your field to your hand when they enter the battlefield, but tap for 2 mana. Combining Amulet with Bounce lands allows you to use them for mana, and then either bounce them or another land to your hand. So if you have an Amulet, a Bounce land, and Summer Bloom, you can play your Bounce land up to 4 times in a single turn by always bouncing it back to your hand, and make up to 8 mana. Though you usually only make 6 mana as you use your first land drop to get the mana to cast Summer Bloom on turn 2. That's fine though, as 6 mana is enough to play something like Primeval Titan, a 6 mana 6/6 with trample that searches for 2 lands and puts them onto the battlefield tapped whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks. This is a crazy combo, letting you get huge creatures and a ton of mana extremely quickly. Even worse, there are lands that can just straight up win you the game pretty easily. Volakut the Molten Pinnacle is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and taps for 1 red. And whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, if you control 5 or more mountains, it deals 3 damage to any target. Combining this with Primeval Titan lets you get up to 5 mountains very quickly, letting you start bolting whatever you want as early as turn 3 with your best draws. This is extremely strong and made Summer Bloom combo decks one of the best decks in the format, able to end games as early as turn 3. In order to stop this combo, Wizards either needed to ban Bloom or Amulet, and they decided that Bloom was the more problematic card. Could Summer Bloom be unbanned? No. Amulet of Vigor, Primeval Titan, and Valakut already form the backbone of one of the best decks in Modern right now, and they've stayed good for years. Unbanning them would probably make the deck too good. And if Wizards ever wanted to make the deck better, they could just print a less busted version of the card later. How could Summer Bloom be fixed to be unbanned? Changing it so that you can only play 2 extra lands that turn would make it so that you can't play Primeval Titan off of it, a bounce land, and Amulet. This would still make the deck better, but not so much better that it would break the format. You could still pull these combos off, but they would require much more specific hands as it does right now. Next up, we have Field of the Dead. This is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and can be tapped to add 1 colorless mana. It also has the ability where, whenever it or another land enters the battlefield under your control, if you have 7 or more lands with different names, you create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. This card was banned back in February of 2021. So, why was Field of the Dead banned? Well, seeing that getting 6 mountains over Valakut wasn't hard enough to stop the card from being great, you could imagine how strong Field of the Dead could be. Field saw play in the same kinds of ramp decks, but also enabled a bunch of different ramp decks in different color combinations, as well as being a fairly low cost include for decks that wanted a better late game and didn't mind it entering the battlefield tapped. There were a few things that make this card ban-worthy, whereas Valakut isn't. First off, Valakut requirements are far more stringent. 6 lands with the mountain type is actually more strict than 7 lands with different names, as there are tons of great lands at Wizards it's printed over the years. This means that Valakut is mostly contained to specific combo decks, whereas Field can go into any ramp deck at all. This ultimately made the card far more oppressive, as there was very little deck building cost to playing the card. Additionally, it being a land made the card incredibly difficult to interact with. Even if you had something like Field of Ruin to destroy it, your opponent would usually still get a zombie out of the deal, so they still got value. The only real answer to Field is a card like Blood Moon, which lots of decks can't afford to run. Once a ramp deck gets to 7 lands, it's extremely hard to come back, as they'll have a constant stream of threats for the rest of the game. This makes it really hard for any deck that isn't a combo or aggro deck to ever beat them, as they'll always outvalue any mid-range or control deck they play against. This also applies to Valakut, but it being easier to meet Field's requirements and the fact that Amulet Titan decks could run both Valakut and Field is what made this card so problematic. Field made these land-based decks more consistent, more generic, and even harder to interact with. Could Field of the Dead be unbanned? No. It would give Amulet Titan decks way too good of a matchup against too many decks. A lot of the sideboard cards that decks might play to stop Amulet Titan decks, like Alpine Moon, aren't anywhere near as useful. The combination of being so taxing on sideboard slots and being so hard for any fair decks to beat means that giving ramp decks another card like Valakut would be far too much and make anything other than aggro and combo decks almost impossible to play in the format. How could Field of the Dead be fixed to be unbanned? This is extremely hard to do without completely changing the card. Being a land means that it's basically impossible to give the card any kind of cost. On top of that, giving Valakut decks a second card with even a similar effect would make them very hard to beat. The best answer I can come up with is changing it from a triggered ability to something like pay 5, tap, and sacrifice it to make a zombie for each differently named land you control, with the restrictions that you have to have at least 7 lands of different names to activate this ability, and you can only do this at sorcery speed. This would make the card strong and leave it with a lot of the same effects that it has right now, but adding an actual mana cost would make it slow enough that it wouldn't be impossible to beat. Next up, we have Mystic Sanctuary. This is a land with the island land type, meaning it can tap to add 1 blue. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands, and when it enters the battlefield untapped, you can put target instant or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. This card was banned at the same time as Field of the Dead in February of 2021. Why was Mystic Sanctuary banned? Mystic Sanctuary was banned due to how it interacts with fetch lands. You see, because Sanctuary has the island type, cards like Scalding Tarn can find it and put it directly into the battlefield, because they only care that they have the proper land type, not if they're basic or not. This means that blue decks, once they have 3 islands, can turn any of the 4 different fetch lands that can find islands, meaning they can run 20 copies of that card to find it, and get back whatever instant or sorcery they want. This made blue decks extremely consistent. And if they ever need to find a card that already happened to be in their graveyard, they basically always could. Even worse, cards like Cryptic Command could return your own Sanctuary back to your hand, allowing you to play it again and get back whatever you want. With 2 Cryptics, you could actually loop Sanctuary every turn, making it so that you always draw Cryptic Command on your card for a turn. And since Cryptic also lets you counter a spell, draw a card, or tap all of your opponent's creatures, as well as bounce your Sanctuary, pulling this loop off usually just won you the game, or at least made it so that your opponent can't ever win the game. The consistency of being able to get whatever you want out of your graveyard was the main reason this card was banned, but the Cryptic loop certainly didn't help. Can Mystic Sanctuary be unbanned? This is another no. Sanctuary was way too splashable into too many decks, and it just kinda made blue decks a lot more consistent and powerful than other colors. Some of the strongest decks in Modern are already blue decks, so unbanning it would just make them even stronger for no reason. Not to mention that it would lead to far more repetitive games ending in Cryptic command loops. This isn't as bad as other banned cards, though. It's a lot closer to being able to be unbanned than a lot of the other cards. How could Mystic Sanctuary be fixed to be unbanned? All that needs to change is removing the island type and giving it the ability to tap for blue without it. The only real problem with this card is being able to be searched off of fetch lands, so removing that fixes the card. Sure, Cryptic command loops would still exist, but they wouldn't be anywhere near as bad without those decks being able to fetch Sanctuary whenever they want to start the lock. Making Sanctuary unfetchable fixes pretty much all the problems with the card. Last of all, we have Punishing Fire. This is an instant with the mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has the ability where whenever an opponent gains life, you pay 1 red to return it from your graveyard to your hand, and it has the effect to deal 2 damage to any target. This card was banned all the way back in December of 2011. Why was Punishing Fire banned? On its own, Punishing Fire isn't very good. The problem is combining it with the card Grove of the Burn Willows. This is a land that you can either tap to add 1 colorless or tap for 1 red or 1 green. And then each opponent gains 1 life. With this, you can force your opponent to gain life and make the red mana you need to give your Punishing Fire back. This basically means for the low cost of 1 red mana and giving your opponent 1 life, you can get as many 2 mana shocks as you want. As slow as this is, it's actually viable to simply loop it over and over to kill your opponent. The main problem is that there's no way, outside of very specific cards like Graveyard Hate, to interact with this loop. Even counterspells, which are usually able to answer most cards, can't stop you from looping this and winning eventually. All you need is enough time. Luckily, Fire also helps you get that time by helping you deal with the board. Fire can also kill as many 2 toughness creatures as you want it to. This means that Punishing Fire is always at least okay, but it's back-breaking against any deck that relies on its 1 or 2 toughness creatures. Decks like Merfolk and Death and Taxes, which have historically seen a ton of play in the format, were pretty much unplayable while Punishing Fire was legal. To let these decks exist in the format, Wizards banned Punishing Fire, citing specifically how much it stifled these creature-based strategies. Could Punishing Fire be unbanned? This is another no. The issue with making creature-based decks bad is as present as ever. Now, there's already a card called Fury, which is a creature that you can cast for free by exiling a red card from your hand. But if you do, you have to sacrifice it when it enters the battlefield. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage divided amongst any number of target creatures. Some people will say Fury does the same thing that Wizards claim Punishing Fire has done. However, that's more of an argument for banning Fury more so than unbanning Punishing Fire, if anything. Not only that, but unbanishing Punishing Fire would make these creature-based decks even worse. Fury isn't a card advantage piece. Usually use 2 cards to kill 2 of your opponent's creatures. The reason it's so strong is the tempo you get for getting to remove 2 threats for no mana. Punishing Fire would give these decks a way to fight these decks that's a card advantage engine, meaning that decks would have an amazing tempo and card advantage piece for those matchups, making it almost impossible for those decks to win the matchup. So, in the interest of not making creature decks even worse than they are, Punishing Fire should really stay banned. How could Punishing Fire be fixed to be unbanned? Making it so that the ability triggers when an effect an opponent controls causes them to gain life. You can pay 1 red to return to your hand, and that would fix the problem. The only problematic thing about the card is how it interacts with Burn Willows. Other ways to make your opponent gain life aren't really even worth trying to combo with Punishing Fire. The interaction between these 2 specific cards is really the only issue. Alternatively, you could make it so that it only hits players and not creatures, as the issue is how it punishes creature-based decks, not using the card as a way to win the game over the course of 20 turns. Alright, and that's the video. Do you have any ideas for future videos? Go ahead and leave them down in the comments below.